Dust settles over cracked earth. Blood stains dry wood. 3 outlaws thought they got away. They took Clara Higgins from her father's ranch, leaving burning ruins behind. They wanted ransom. They wanted gold. What they got was a shadow trailing their horses. A drifter with no name, carrying only cold iron and quiet fury. He watched them take her. Now, he hunts. Justice in 1883 didn't come wearing a badge. It came riding a pale horse, carrying a Winchester rifle. This isn't just another dime novel tale. History hid his face, but graves remember his bullets. The year was 1884, and the unforgiving sun of West Texas beat down upon the sprawling, drought-stricken acreage of the Higgins Ranch. Josiah Higgins, a man whose face was mapped with the deep crevices of a life spent fighting the earth for a meager yield, lay motionless in the dust. His farmhouse, a labor of love built over 20 years, was now a roaring pyre of timber and memories. Black smoke billowed into the cloudless azure sky, a violent signal fire visible for miles across the flatlands. Half a mile away, perched upon a limestone ridge that offered a commanding view of the basin, sat a solitary figure on a dappled gray Mustang. He was a man carved from the same harsh landscape that surrounded him. His face was hidden beneath the wide, battered brim of a Stetson, and a duster coat, caked with the alkaline dust of a dozen territories, draped over his broad shoulders. He had no name that he ever offered, no past that he ever spoke of. To the few who had crossed his path and survived, he was simply a ghost that haunted the frontier, a nameless gunman whose reputation was whispered in saloons from Dodge City to Tombstone. Through the polished brass of a telescopic spyglass, the gunman watched the tragedy unfold. He saw the 3 riders tear away from the burning homestead. In the center, struggling fiercely against the ropes that bound her to the saddle horn of a massive roan, was Clara Higgins. She was 22, possessing a fierce, unyielding spirit inherited from her father, and hair the color of spun copper. Leading the pack was a man the gunman recognized instantly, even from a distance. The unmistakable broad shoulders and the customized, silver-plated colt strapped to his thigh belonged to Amos Galloway. Galloway was a predator, a man whose gang had terrorized the New Mexico and Texas borders for 3 years, leaving a trail of robbed stagecoaches and orphaned children. Pinkerton detective records of the era listed Galloway as a prime target, but local law enforcement was either too terrified or too corrupt to bring him in. The nameless man lowered his spyglass. He had stopped at the Higgins Ranch 2 days prior, trading a day of grueling labor mending fences for a hot meal and a place to rest his horse in their barn. Josiah had been a decent man, offering the stranger a pull of decent bourbon and treating him with a rare, uncomplicated respect. Clara had served him stew, her eyes holding a sharp intelligence that noticed the heavy, worn iron on his hip, though she asked no questions. A debt had been formed in the quiet spaces of that evening. In the brutal economy of the West, a man's life was weighed in gold, but a man's soul was weighed by his debts. He spurred the dappled gray forward, descending the ridge with a practiced, silent grace. By the time he reached the smoldering ruins of the farmhouse, the heat was suffocating. He dismounted, his spurs clinking softly against the baked earth, and knelt beside Josiah. The older man was breathing, though his chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow gasps. A dark, spreading stain of crimson soaked his flannel shirt from a bullet wound to the gut. Josiah's eyes fluttered open, blind with pain until they focused on the shadow looming over him. "Clara," the old man wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his cracked lips. "They took my girl." "Galloway," he said. He said I owed him. The gunman didn't offer empty comforts. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a canteen, and moistened the dying man's lips. "Which way?" His voice was a low gravel, coarse as sandpaper. "South," Josiah whispered, his grip weakly tightening on the gunman's duster. "Toward the Badlands. Please. She's all I have in this cursed world." "Rest now," the gunman said quietly. Josiah Higgins passed away as the last of the farmhouse roof collapsed into a shower of sparks. The nameless man stood up, the silence of the prairie pressing in on him. He didn't bury Josiah, there was no time, and the dead cared little for dirt. Instead, he pulled a tarp from the barn that had miraculously survived the blaze and laid it over the farmer. He walked over to the fresh tracks left by Galloway's horses. The impressions were deep. They were riding hard and fast, confident in their escape. They thought they had simply snatched a valuable pawn to extort money from an old man. They didn't know the old man was already dead. More importantly, they didn't know they were being watched. The Nameless Gunman checked the action of his Winchester 1873 rifle, the oiled steel sliding with a satisfying, deadly click. He slid it back into the scabbard, mounted his gray, and turned his eyes south. The hunt had begun. The trail led deep into the Llano Estacado, a vast, flat mesa that stretched like an ocean of dried grass and mesquite. It was a place where outlaws went to disappear, an empty expanse that swallowed men whole. For 2 days, the Nameless Gunman rode, existing on strips of dried venison and the sheer cold will of his pursuit. He read the land like a scholar reads a rare manuscript. A snapped mesquite branch, an overturned rock, a pile of horse dung, each was a syllable in the story Galloway was leaving behind. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the narrative of the tracks suddenly changed. The steady 3-horse gallop became erratic. There were signs of a struggle in the dirt-deep scuff marks from heavy boots, blood sprayed across a patch of prickly pear cactus, and then only 2 sets of horse tracks continuing south. The gunman dismounted, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his peacemaker. He moved cautiously through the brush, following a drag mark. Beneath the meager shade of a twisted juniper tree, he found him. It was Billy Two Fingers Cobb, one of Galloway's most loyal lackeys. Billy was in a bad way. A bullet had shattered his collarbone, and a deep knife wound in his side was weeping dark blood into the parched soil. He was delirious, muttering to himself, his face pale and slick with the sweat of an approaching death. The gunman stepped into Billy's line of sight, blocking out the sun. Billy blinked, his eyes struggling to focus. "Galloway?" he croaked, terror seizing his features. "No," the gunman replied, his tone devoid of any sympathy. He crouched down, noting the missing saddle and horse. "Galloway left you for the buzzards. Where is he taking the girl?" Billy let out a wet, rattling cough, spitting blood onto his own chin. You ain't the law. Law don't come out this far. I asked a question." The gunman drew his revolver, not pointing it at Billy, but resting the cold barrel against his own knee. The implication was clear. "Speak or die with your sins untold." "Miller's Crossing," Billy gasped, clutching his bleeding side. "An old trading post near the canyon rim." "Why did he take Clara Higgins?" The gunman pressed. "Josiah didn't have the money to pay a ransom, and Galloway isn't a man who wastes time." A bitter, agonized laugh escaped Billy's lips. "Ransom? You think this is about ransom? You're blind, mister. It ain't about the farmer's money. It's about Thaddeus Cornwall." The name struck a chord in the gunman's memory. Thaddeus Cornwall was a ruthless industrialist, a man who built his railroad empire on the broken backs of workers and the stolen lands of independent ranchers. "Cornwall wants the valley," Billy continued, his voice fading. "He's buying up the local lawmakers, pushing the railroad straight through the basin. But Josiah Higgins, that stubborn old mule, he held the master deed to the main river access. Cornwall couldn't buy him, so he hired Galloway to burn him out. And the girl? The girl." Billy's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and twisted admiration. "She's smarter than her old man. Before we lit the match, she got her hands on a ledger. One of Cornwall's surveyors got drunk in town a week back, dropped his saddlebags. Clara found it. That ledger proves Cornwall is bribing federal judges to steal the land. If that book makes it to the territorial governor, Cornwall hangs." The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. This wasn't a simple kidnapping. This was a high-stakes political assassination disguised as a frontier tragedy. Clara wasn't a hostage for ransom. She was a loose end that Galloway intended to tie up permanently once he recovered the ledger. "Where is the book?" the gunman asked. "She hid it," Billy whispered, his eyes rolling back. "Won't tell Amos where. That's why she's still breathing. Amos cut me down because I wanted to cut our losses, said we had enough heat on us." Billy drew a final, shuddering breath, and his eyes fixed blindly on the Texas sky. The Nameless Gunman stood up, holstering his weapon. The stakes had just escalated. He wasn't just saving a girl anymore. He was stepping into a war against one of the most powerful men in the territory. It didn't change his objective. It only meant there would be more bodies to bury. He swung back into his saddle, dug his heels into the gray's flanks, and rode hard toward Miller's Crossing. Miller's Crossing wasn't a town. It was a rotting wooden scab on the edge of a massive, echoing canyon. It consisted of a decrepit trading post, a livery stable that smelled of decay, and a saloon that poured watered-down whiskey to men who preferred the shadows. As the sun began to bleed red and purple across the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows over the canyon, the Nameless Gunman arrived at the outskirts. He tied his horse half a mile back in a dry wash, proceeding on foot. He moved with the silence of a hunting cougar, slipping between the jagged rocks and scrub oak until he had a clear vantage point of the crossing. 2 horses were tied to the hitching post outside the saloon. One was the massive roan from the Higgins ranch. Galloway and his remaining man were inside. The gunman crept closer, pressing his back against the rough, splintered wood of the saloon's rear wall. A dirty, cracked window allowed him a view of the interior. The room was lit by a single, sputtering kerosene lamp hanging over the bar. The barkeep, a nervous, balding man named Miller, was cowering in the corner. At the center table sat Amos Galloway, nursing a glass of whiskey. Across from him, tied to a wooden chair, was Clara Higgins. Her face was bruised, her dress torn and covered in soot from the fire, but her eyes blazed with an unextinguished defiance. Galloway leaned forward, slamming a heavy, silver-ringed fist on the table. "I'm losing my patience, little bird," he growled, his voice carrying through the thin glass. "Mister, Cornwall pays me to solve problems, not negotiate with them. You tell me where you buried that ledger, and I might just let you walk out into that desert instead of putting a bullet in your head right now." Clara spat a wad of blood onto the floorboards near Galloway's boots. "Go to hell, Amos. You kill me, you never find it. And Cornwall will skin you alive for failing." Galloway's face contorted with rage. He stood up, drawing his silver-plated Colt, and pressed the barrel against Clara's temple. "I don't need the book," he hissed. "I just need to know you can't talk." The Nameless Gunman didn't hesitate. He knew the structural layout of these cheap frontier buildings. Instead of busting through the back door and announcing his presence, he took 2 steps back, raised his Winchester, and aimed at the sputtering kerosene lamp swinging above Galloway's head. He squeezed the trigger. Crack. The lamp shattered. Kerosene rained down upon the dry, dusty floorboards and across Galloway's shoulders, instantly igniting into a sheet of roaring flame. The saloon was plunged into a chaotic mixture of sudden darkness and violent dancing firelight. Galloway screamed as the fire caught the fabric of his coat, dropping his gun to bat at the flames. His remaining deputy, a wiry killer named Jackson, drew his weapons and spun wildly in the dark, trying to find the source of the shot. The Nameless Gunman kicked the rear door off its rusty hinges, diving into the smoke-filled room. Jackson fired blindly toward the sound, the muzzle flashes illuminating his panicked face. The gunman hit the floor, rolled to his right, and fired his Winchester from the hip. The heavy, 44-40 slug caught Jackson in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward over the bar, shattering bottles in a cascade of cheap liquor. The fire was spreading rapidly, climbing the dry timber walls of the saloon. Galloway, having managed to shed his burning coat, lunged for his dropped Colt. The gunman was faster. He dropped the rifle, drawing his peacemaker in a fluid, blurring motion, and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the floorboards mere inches from Galloway's reaching hand, showering the outlaw's face with wood splinters. "Touch it," the Nameless Gunman commanded, stepping out of the shadows, the barrel of his revolver leveled at Galloway's heart. "Please." Galloway froze, looking up at the towering, dust-covered figure. Recognition dawned in the outlaw's eyes, replaced quickly by cold dread. He had heard the stories. "You." Galloway breathed over the roar of the growing fire. "Cornwall will kill you for this. He owns this whole territory." "He doesn't own me," the gunman replied softly. He holstered his weapon, stepping past Galloway. He drew a bowie knife and swiftly cut the ropes binding Clara to the chair. Clara stumbled forward, gasping for air, but the gunman caught her arm, steadying her. "Are you hit?" he asked. "No." She coughed. eyeing him with a mixture of shock and recognition. You're the man from the barn. We need to move. This building is coming down." He turned back to Galloway, who was still kneeling on the floor, watching his empire of fear burn around him. "Your horse is outside," the gunman said to the outlaw. "Ride back to Cornwall. Tell him the ledger is gone. Tell him I'm coming for him next." Without waiting to see if Galloway obeyed, the nameless gunman dragged Clara out of the front doors of the saloon just as the roof began to cave in, sending a plume of sparks into the dark desert sky. They ran toward the dry wash where the gray Mustang was waiting. Clara, exhausted and battered, finally collapsed against the side of the horse, tears streaking through the dirt on her face. "My father," she cried softly. "He killed him." "I know," the gunman said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I was there. He sent me to find you." Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide. "He sent a ghost? He sent a gun." The man pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "Billy Two Fingers talked before he died. I know about Cornwall. I know about the ledger. Is it safe?" Clara took a long drink, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Yes. I buried it under the floorboards of the old mission church 3 miles from our ranch. Before Amos's men arrived, I knew they were coming. Cornwall's men have been harassing us for months. Then we go back," the gunman said, mounting the gray and offering his hand to pull her up behind him. "We get the ledger, and we ride to the capital." "Cornwall has 50 men on his payroll," Clara warned, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist as the horse shifted beneath them. "They'll be waiting for us. We're just 2 people." The nameless gunman looked back at the burning inferno of Miller's Crossing, the flames reflecting in his cold, calculating eyes. "Then we'll need more bullets." Midnight draped over the West Texas plains like a heavy wool blanket, pierced only by the cold, indifferent light of a waning moon. The dappled gray Mustang moved with a steady, ground-eating lope, carrying double the weight, but showing no signs of faltering. The nameless gunman sat rigid in the saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, while Clara Higgins clung to him, her exhaustion warring with the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. 3 miles from the smoldering ashes of the Higgins Ranch stood the ruins of San Miguel, an abandoned Spanish mission that had surrendered to the desert decades ago. Its adobe walls were crumbling, melting back into the earth from which they were formed, and its bell tower leaned precariously against the night sky. It was a place of ghosts and forgotten prayers, making it the perfect vault for a secret that could hang a millionaire. "Pull up by the old cemetery," Clara whispered, her voice raspy from the smoke of Miller's Crossing. "There's a side entrance through the sacristy that can't be seen from the main trail." The gunman guided the Mustang into the shadow of the mission's eastern wall, dismounting in a fluid motion. He drew his Winchester, the metallic clack of a round chambering echoing too loudly in the dead silence. He handed the reins to Clara. "Wait here. Keep the horse quiet." He moved like a phantom through the cemetery, his boots stepping lightly over sunken graves marked by rotting wooden crosses. He reached the heavy oak door of the sacristy, testing the rusted iron latch. It gave way with a groan that made his jaw tighten. He slipped inside, letting the darkness swallow him. He waited, letting his eyes adjust, listening past the wind whistling through the cracks in the adobe. Nothing but silence met him. He stepped back out and motioned for Clara. She tied the gray to a mesquite bush and hurried inside, moving with a practiced familiarity through the ruined chapel. The roof had caved in long ago, allowing moonlight to spill across the cracked stone floor. "Under the altar," Clara said, dropping to her knees before a massive slab of weathered limestone. She began to claw at the packed earth and loose stones at the base of the altar. The gunman knelt beside her, using his Bowie knife to pry away a particularly stubborn flagstone. Beneath it lay a hollowed-out cavity. Clara reached in and pulled out an oilcloth-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a thick, leather-bound ledger. The pages were filled with names, dates, and amounts the damning mathematics of Thaddeus Cornwall's corruption. Real names dotted the margins, local sheriffs bought with railroad gold, state politicians swayed by land grants, and even a rogue agent from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a man named Jasper Cole, who acted as Cornwall's chief enforcer. "We have it," Clara breathed. a mixture of triumph and sorrow in her eyes. This proves Cornwall paid Amos Galloway to burn out the ranchers who wouldn't sell. It proves he bought Judge Hanlon in Austin. Put it away, the gunman said, his head suddenly snapping toward the gaping archway of the main entrance. His instincts, honed by years of surviving ambushes, were screaming at him. A voice, smooth as oiled leather and cold as a coffin nail, drifted out of the darkness. "I'll take that book, Miss Higgins, and I'll take it without the oilcloth." Stepping into the moonlight from the courtyard was Jasper Cole himself. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit that seemed entirely out of place in the desert, a bowler hat resting atop his head. He carried a customized Schofield revolver in his right hand. Behind him, the shadows detached themselves from the walls. 6 men, armed with repeating rifles and shotguns, fanned out across the entrance. Cornwall hadn't just sent Galloway to tie up loose ends. He had sent his best hound to ensure the job was done. "You're a hard man to track," Cole said, addressing the Nameless Gunman. Galloway came back to camp, missing his pride and a few men. "Told Cornwall some drifter shot up Miller's Crossing. But you're not just a drifter, are you? I've heard the stories of a man who shoots like a demon and leaves no name behind." "Talk is cheap, Cole," the gunman replied, his voice a low rumble. He slowly stepped in front of Clara, shielding her and the ledger. "Bullets cost money, and Cornwall has plenty of both." Cole chuckled. He raised his Schofield. "Kill the man. Leave the girl." The courtyard erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire. The gunman didn't try to outdraw 6 men in the open. He tackled Clara, driving them both behind the thick limestone altar, just as a hail of lead chewed through the air where they had been standing seconds before. Stone shards rained down upon them like deadly hail. "Stay down!" the gunman roared over the cacophony. He rolled to his right, coming up at the edge of the altar with his Winchester raised. He didn't aim. He let his muscle memory take over. He fired 3 times in rapid succession, the lever of the rifle working so fast it was a blur of motion. The first shot caught a man with a shotgun in the throat, dropping him instantly. The second and third shots found the chest of a rifleman who had stepped out of cover to get a better angle. Cole cursed, retreating behind a crumbling adobe pillar. "Flush him out. Get round the back." The gunmen knew they couldn't stay pinned. The altar provided cover from the front, but the chapel was open on 3 sides. "The catacombs," he said to Clara, grabbing her arm. "Is there a way out?" "There's an old cellar door behind the choir loft," she shouted back, clutching the ledger to her chest. "It leads out to the arroyo behind the mission. Run on my signal. Don't look back." The gunman reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a stick of dynamite, a little insurance policy he had picked up from a mining camp a month prior. He bit the fuse, striking a match against the stone floor, and lit it. The fuse hissed violently. He waited 2 seconds, then hurled the explosive over the altar toward the entrance. "Fire in the hole!" one of Cole's men screamed. The explosion tore through the night, a blinding flash of orange and white that shook the very foundations of the mission. Dust, rocks, and splintered wood filled the air, choking the courtyard in an impenetrable cloud of debris. "Now!" the gunman yelled. Clara scrambled to her feet and sprinted toward the rear of the chapel, the gunman right behind her, his peacemaker drawn and firing blindly into the dust cloud to keep Cole's men pinned down. They reached the choir loft, Clara tearing away a rotting piece of canvas to reveal a heavy wooden trapdoor. She hauled it open, coughing on the thick dust, and descended the stone steps into pitch blackness. The gunman fired one last shot into the swirling smoke before diving into the cellar, pulling the heavy door shut and dropping the iron crossbar into place, just as boots pounded onto the stone floor above them. "They'll blow the door," the gunman said, striking another match to illuminate the damp, narrow tunnel. "Move." They hurried through the suffocating darkness of the old escape tunnel, the air smelling of earth and ancient decay. Above them, muffled shouts and the thud of heavy boots echoed ominously. The tunnel sloped downward, narrowing until they had to turn sideways to squeeze past collapsed sections of the earthen walls. After what felt like an eternity, the air grew cooler, and a faint patch of starlight appeared ahead. They spilled out into a dry, sandy arroyo, chest-heaving and covered in centuries of dust. The gray Mustang, spooked by the explosion, had broken its tether and was nowhere to be seen. "We're on foot," the gunman stated, assessing their bleak situation. They were miles from civilization, hunted by an army, and carrying a death warrant in the form of a ledger. Clara leaned against the sandy bank of the arroyo, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down at the leather-bound book in her hands. "Was it worth it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My father is dead. The ranch is gone. And now, we're going to die out here." The nameless gunman looked at her, his hardened features softened by the pale moonlight. "Josiah died so you could live. He died because he believed some things are worth more than dirt and gold. We don't die today, Clara. We ride." He turned his gaze toward the east, where the sky was just beginning to bruise with the first hints of dawn. "There's a railroad boomtown called Oakhaven 20 miles from here. It has a telegraph office. We get there, we wire the ledger's contents to Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith. He's federal. Cornwall can't buy him." "Oakhaven is Cornwall's headquarters," Clara protested, her eyes widening in terror. "It's a fortress. We'd be walking right into the devil's mouth." The gunman checked the cylinder of his Colt, snapping it shut with a definitive metallic ring. "The devil shouldn't have left his front door open. Let's walk." The 20-mile trek across the unforgiving Texas scrubland was a brutal test of endurance. The sun rose like an angry copper coin, baking the earth and turning the air into a shimmering mirage of heat. They walked in silence, conserving their precious moisture, the nameless gunman leading the way, his eyes forever scanning the horizon for Cole's riders. They found a muddy seep hole by mid-afternoon, drinking the gritty, lukewarm water as if it were fine wine, before pressing on. By dusk, the booming sounds of industry reached them before the town itself did. The rhythmic, thunderous pounding of steam-powered pile drivers and the shrill scream of locomotive whistles echoed across the plains. As they crested a low ridge, Oakhaven sprawled before them. It was a scar upon the land, a massive encampment of canvas tents, cheap pine structures, and towering plumes of black coal smoke. It was a town built entirely around the railroad, teeming with laborers, gamblers, prostitutes, and the heavily armed enforcers on Thaddeus Cornwall's payroll. "The telegraph office is in the brick building near the depot," Clara whispered, pointing toward a 2-story structure that stood out among the shanties. "It's guarded around the clock." "I need you to stay here," the gunman said, gesturing to a cluster of massive sandstone boulders overlooking the town. "If I don't come back by dawn, you take the ledger and head north to the Brazos River. Find a ranger. Don't trust anyone wearing a local badge." Clara grabbed his sleeve, her knuckles white. "You can't fight the whole town." "I don't have to," he replied, gently removing her hand. "I just have to hold a room for 5 minutes." He took the ledger from her, tucking it securely into the inner pocket of his duster, and began the descent into Oakhaven. The streets were a chaotic soup of mud, manure, and drunken revelry. The gunman pulled his hat low, blending into the throng of grimy laborers and drifters. He moved with purpose, avoiding the brightly lit saloons where Cornwall's men congregated, favoring the dark alleys that ran behind the main thoroughfare. He reached the back of the brick telegraph office. 2 men, armed with Winchester rifles, stood near the rear door, casually smoking cigarettes and complaining about the heat. The gunman didn't hesitate. He emerged from the shadows like a striking viper. He brought the heavy brass butt plate of his rifle crashing down on the first guard's skull, dropping him instantly without a sound. Before the second guard could react or yell, the gunman stepped inside his guard, drove a brutal punch into his solar plexus, and caught the man as he folded, lowering him silently into the mud. He tested the door. Locked. He drew his Bowie knife, wedged it between the door frame and the latch, and applied pressure until the cheap iron lock snapped with a sharp crack. He slipped inside. The telegraph operator, a scrawny young man with ink-stained fingers, was sitting at his desk, tapping out a mundane message. He looked up, his eyes bulging as the dust-covered, imposing figure of the gunman loomed over him, a peacemaker leveled directly at his face. "Get off the line," the gunman ordered, his voice cold and flat. The operator threw his hands up, stammering, "Mister, I don't have any money. I don't want your money. I want an open line to Fort Smith, Arkansas, direct to the office of U.S. District Judge Isaac Parker." The operator paled. I can't do that. Mr. Cornwall monitors all outgoing federal wires. If I send a message to the hanging judge, Cornwall will have me strung up from the water tower. The gunman cocked the hammer of his Colt. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. "Cornwall might hang you tomorrow. I will kill you right now. Open the line." Trembling violently, the operator turned back to his brass key. He tapped out the routing sequence, his fingers slipping on the sweat-slicked metal. A few seconds later, the machine clicked back a response. "Line is open to Fort Smith," the operator whispered. The gunman pulled the ledger from his coat, tossing it onto the desk. "Open it to the first page. Transcribe every name, date, and bribe amount. Don't stop until I tell you to." The operator opened the book, his eyes widening as he read the damning figures. He hesitated for only a second before his fingers began to fly furiously over the key, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack filling the room, sending Cornwall's death warrant across the wire. Outside, a shout shattered the night. The incapacitated guards had been found. "Keep typing," the gunman barked, stepping away from the desk and moving toward the front windows overlooking the street. He peered through the dusty glass. A dozen men were sprinting toward the telegraph office, led by a man with a bowler hat. Jasper Cole. "They're coming!" the operator cried out, freezing at the sound of boots slamming onto the wooden boardwalk outside. "I said, keep typing!" the gunman roared, shattering the front window with the barrel of his Winchester. He didn't wait for them to breach the door. He opened fire, his rifle spitting flame into the street. The lead runner took a bullet to the shoulder and spun into the mud. The rest of Cornwall's men dove for cover behind water troughs and rain barrels, returning fire. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the office, shattering the lamps and sending glass showering over the desk. The operator screamed, diving under the table, his hand still desperately tapping the key above him. "We got him boxed in," Cole yelled from behind a sturdy oak wagon across the street. "Fill that building with lead." The nameless gunman moved like a machine, ducking, rolling, and firing. He reloaded his Winchester with practiced speed, shoving fresh cartridges through the loading gate even as splinters rained down upon his shoulders. A bullet grazed his left bicep, slicing through the duster and drawing a hot line of blood, but he didn't even flinch. He fired at a man trying to flank the building, dropping him with a shot to the knee. "How much is sent?" he yelled to the operator. "2 pages," the kid sobbed from under the desk. "I'm sending the judge's name now, Hanlon, Austin District." That was enough. It was enough to trigger a federal investigation, enough to bring Judge Parker's marshals down on Oakhaven like the wrath of God. Cornwall's empire was officially burning, but surviving the fire was another matter. "Stop typing," the gunman commanded. He grabbed the ledger off the desk, stuffing it back into his coat. He hauled the terrified operator out from under the desk by his collar, out the back door. "Run into the rail yards and don't stop until you hit the next county." The operator didn't need to be told twice. He bolted through the rear exit, disappearing into the night. The gunman stood alone in the dark, smoke-filled office. The gunfire outside had paused. They were gearing up to rush the building. He checked his weapons. 5 rounds left in the Winchester, 6 in the Peacemaker. He took a deep breath, the smell of cordite and dry earth filling his lungs. It was a good night to die, but he had promised a girl he wouldn't. He kicked the front door open, stepping out into the moonlight, his guns raised, ready to face the devil's army. Stepping through the shattered frame of the telegraph office door, the nameless gunman didn't offer Jasper Cole the courtesy of a monologue. The moment his boot hit the dusty boardwalk, he fired. He didn't aim for the men, he aimed for the environment. His first shot from the Winchester shattered the thick iron chain suspending a massive, oil-filled street lamp directly above Cole's makeshift barricade. The lamp crashed down upon the oak wagon, erupting into a violent cascade of liquid fire. 2 of Cornwall's hired guns screamed as the burning oil splashed across their coats, abandoning their cover and rolling frantically in the muddy street. Jasper Cole, ever the survivor, had already dived backward into the trough of a nearby saloon, his bowler hat tumbling into the muck. "Take him down! I want him breathing, but I don't care if he's walking." Cole's voice roared over the crackle of the flames. The street erupted into a blinding crossfire. Lead chewed through the wooden boardwalk and turned the brick facade of the telegraph office into a cloud of red dust. The gunman moved with terrifying economy. He threw himself over a cast-iron blacksmith's anvil that sat outside a neighboring stable, using the dense metal to absorb the incoming volley. Clang, clang, thwack. Bullets sparked against the anvil, singing past his ears like angry hornets. He peered around the edge of the iron block. 4 men were advancing cautiously through the smoke, their repeating rifles raised to their shoulders. The gunman swapped his empty Winchester for his Colt Peacemaker. He cocked the hammer, took a steady breath, and rolled out from behind the anvil. He fired 3 times in less than 2 seconds. The first shot caught an advancing rifleman in the knee, folding him instantly. The second and third shots found the chest and shoulder of the men flanking him. The 4th man panicked, firing wildly into the air before retreating behind the burning wagon. "He's pinned," a voice yelled from the roof of the saloon across the street. A sniper. The gunman saw the glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel from the 2nd-story parapet. He didn't have the angle. He needed a distraction, and he needed it immediately. He unhooked his heavy gun belt, leaving it coiled behind the anvil, and grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the stable wall. With a savage heave, he hurled the pitchfork into the hindquarters of a team of draft horses hitched to a heavy freight wagon resting in the alleyway. The horses shrieked, rearing up in terror. Driven mad by the sudden pain and the roaring gunfire, the massive beasts bolted. The 2-ton wagon tore out of the alley, careening blindly into the main street right through the line of Cornwall's men. Men scrambled and dove into the mud to avoid being crushed beneath the heavy iron-rimmed wheels. Using the chaos of the runaway wagon, the gunman broke cover. He sprinted toward the rail yard, vaulting over a stack of fresh-cut pine ties. The sniper on the roof fired, the bullet tearing through the shoulder of the gunman's duster, grazing the flesh with a hot, burning kiss, but the drifter didn't break his stride. He vanished into the labyrinth of parked freight cars and towering, steam-hissing locomotives. He moved silently between the iron behemoths, his breathing controlled despite the burning pain in his left arm and the graze on his bicep. He navigated by the shadows until he reached the edge of the boomtown, slipping past the final perimeter of drunk, inattentive guards. By the time he reached the sandstone boulders overlooking Oakhaven, the eastern horizon was bleeding a pale, bruised purple. Clara was waiting, clutching the ledger to her chest. Her eyes widened when she saw the blood soaking through his coat. "You're shot," she gasped, rushing forward to help him sit against a cool stone. "A scratch," he rasped, though the paleness of his face betrayed the toll of the night. He pulled off his duster, allowing Clara to rip a long strip of cotton from her petticoat to bind the wound tightly. The wire went through. "Judge Parker has the names. By tomorrow, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves and his posse will be riding hard from Fort Smith. Cornwall's empire is on borrowed time." Clara tied the makeshift bandage off with a sharp tug, her hands shaking. "That doesn't help us tonight. The whole town is awake. They're going to scour the desert." The gunman looked down at the massive rail yard, where men carrying lanterns were already fanning out like a swarm of angry fireflies. "We aren't going into the desert. We're taking Cornwall's own road out of here." He pointed to a massive, iron-black locomotive hissing steam at the head of a long line of freight cars on the northbound track. "The 4 a.m. freight to Fort Worth. It leaves in 10 minutes. If we're on it, we bypass their hunting parties on the plains." Clara looked at the heavily guarded train depot, then back at the bleeding, exhausted man. "You're crazy. It's kept me alive this long," he muttered, grabbing his rifle. "Stay close. And whatever happens, don't drop that book." The infiltration of the northbound freight was a desperate gamble paid for in blood and shadows. They crept down the ridge, using the deafening, rhythmic churning of the locomotive's steam pistons to mask their approach. The train was carrying a load of raw timber, Texas cattle, and newly minted railroad steel. They bypassed the caboose, where 2 of Cornwall's armed guards were drinking coffee and smoking cigars. Instead, the gunman led Clara to a livestock car near the middle of the train. He slid the heavy wooden door open just wide enough for them to squeeze through, sealing them inside the suffocating, manure-scented darkness alongside 30 head of nervous, shifting longhorns. With a lurch that nearly knocked them off their feet, the massive iron wheels began to grind against the steel tracks. The train whistle shrieked, a mournful wail that echoed across the mesa, and the 4 a.m. freight slowly pulled out of Oakhaven, For the first few hours, the only sounds were the clack-clack of the wheels, the groaning of the timber frame, and the lowing of the cattle. Clara huddled in the corner behind a bale of hay, the ledger wrapped tightly in her arms. The nameless gunman sat by the slatted wall, watching the moonlit desert blur past through the narrow gaps, his Winchester resting across his knees. He didn't sleep. He hadn't slept in 3 days. As dawn broke, painting the Texas sky in vibrant streaks of orange and gold, the train's speed suddenly began to decrease. The gunman stood up, pressing his eye against the wooden slats. The tracks ahead curved sharply, entering a steep, rocky defile known to the locals as Dead Man's Cut, and sitting squarely across the tracks, blocking the path of the roaring locomotive, was a massive pile of burning railroad ties. They telegraphed ahead, the gunman said, his voice devoid of panic but heavy with the grim reality of their situation. Cole didn't fall for the desert search. He knew we'd take the train. Clara scrambled to her feet. "What do we do? We don't get taken alive," he replied, checking the loading gate of his rifle. The engineer slammed on the air brakes. The train screeched in mechanical agony, sparks showering from the wheels as hundreds of tons of steel violently fought momentum. The cattle panicked, thrashing and bellowing within the confined space. Before the train even came to a complete halt, gunfire erupted from the canyon walls above. Cornwall's men had set an ambush. "Take the engine! Kill the crew! Find the girl!" The muffled shout belonged to Jasper Cole, riding hard alongside the slowing train on a black stallion, a sawed-off shotgun resting on his thigh. "Stay down." Beneath the hay, the gunman ordered Clara. He pushed the heavy sliding door open a foot, exposing the morning air and the chaotic battlefield outside. He didn't wait to be cornered in the cattle car. The gunman slipped through the opening, clinging to the iron ladder on the exterior of the moving car. The wind whipped at his duster as he scaled the side, hauling himself onto the slightly curved wooden roof of the freight car. He was instantly exposed. 2 of Cole's men, riding parallel to the train, spotted him. They raised their rifles, but the gunman fired first from the hip, dropping the lead rider from his saddle. The second rider's horse spooked, veering away from the tracks and into a shallow ravine. The train finally ground to a violent halt inches from the burning barricade. Men were already swarming the locomotive, dragging the engineer from the cab. The nameless gunman ran across the roof of the cattle car, his boots slipping on the morning dew. He had to stop them from securing the train. He leapt the 3-foot gap between the cars, landing heavily on the roof of a car filled with lumber. "Up top!" a voice screamed from below. A large, bearded enforcer named Boone hauled himself up the ladder at the far end of the lumber car. Boone held a double-barreled shotgun and wore a confident, gold-toothed grin. "End of the line, Drifter," Boone sneered, raising the heavy weapon. The gunman didn't slow his sprint. He didn't raise his rifle. As Boone pulled the trigger, the gunman dropped into a baseball slide on the wooden planks. The buckshot roared over his head, shredding the empty air where his chest had been a fraction of a second before. Before Boone could adjust his aim for the second barrel, the gunman swung his Winchester upward like a club from his sliding position. The heavy brass receiver smashed violently into Boone's kneecap. The giant man roared in pain, his leg buckling. The gunman swept Boone's other leg out from under him, sending the enforcer tumbling off the side of the train to the rocky ground 20 feet below. The gunman rolled back to his feet, but his victory was short-lived. Rising from the roof of the next car forward, climbing up from the flatbed of steel rails, was Jasper Cole. The enforcer had lost his bowler hat, and his suit was covered in coal dust, but his eyes were alight with a terrifying, predatory calm. He held his custom Schofield revolver in one hand, and a long, wicked-looking hunting knife in the other. "You're a persistent ghost," Cole shouted over the hiss of the train's release steam. "But ghosts don't bleed, and I see you bleeding." "I've got enough blood left to drown you, Cole," the gunman replied, his finger tightening on the trigger of his Winchester. "Let's test that theory." Cole didn't fire. He sprinted across the flatbed, leaping onto the lumber car directly toward the gunman. The nameless drifter raised his rifle, but a sudden jolt shook the entire train. Up front, Cornwall's men had cleared the barricade and forced a terrified brakeman to throw the engine back into gear. The train lurched violently forward. The sudden movement threw the gunman off balance. His shot went wide, shattering the smokestack of a distant cabin. Cole closed the distance in a heartbeat, tackling the gunman around the waist. The two men crashed onto the hard wooden roof, sliding dangerously close to the edge. The Winchester was knocked from the gunman's hands, clattering off the side of the train. Cole drove his knee into the gunman's wounded left arm, drawing a sharp hiss of pain from the drifter. Cole raised the hunting knife, plunging it down toward the gunman's throat. The drifter caught Cole's wrist with his right hand, his muscles straining against the enforcer's weight. The train was picking up speed again, rattling and shaking violently as it navigated the narrow canyon walls. "Cornwall sends his regards," Cole spat, pressing his weight down, the tip of the blade inching closer to the gunman's jugular. The nameless gunman stared up into the eyes of the killer. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. He simply let go of Cole's wrist. Surprised by the sudden lack of resistance, Cole lunged forward, overcommitting his weight. The gunman twisted his torso violently to the side, allowing the knife to bury itself to the hilt in the wooden planks of the roof right next to his ear. Using Cole's forward momentum, the gunman brought his right knee up, driving it brutally into Cole's ribs with the force of a kicking mule. The breath exploded from Cole's lungs, and his grip on the knife handle faltered. The gunman threw the gasping enforcer off him, scrambling to his feet. He drew his peacemaker, but Cole, recovering with terrifying speed, kicked the gunman's hand, sending the heavy revolver spinning across the roof. It was down to fists and bone on top of a speeding freight train. Cole threw a desperate, wild punch. The gunman ducked under it, driving two rapid, piston-like blows into Cole's gut, followed by a devastating right cross that connected squarely with Cole's jaw. Blood sprayed from the enforcer's mouth, and he stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the edge of the roof. Cole pinwheeled his arms, his eyes widening in sudden realization as he lost his balance. He grabbed the front of the gunman's duster, trying to pull him down with him. The nameless gunman simply stood his ground, unfastening the single button holding the coat together. Cole slipped backward, pulling the empty duster from the gunman's shoulders, and plummeted off the side of the train, vanishing into the rocky gorge below with a fading scream. The gunman stood alone on the roof of the lumber car, the wind tearing at his sweat-soaked shirt. He retrieved his peacemaker and climbed back down the ladder into the cattle car. Clara was waiting, pale but unharmed, clutching the ledger. She looked at him, noticing the missing coat and the fresh blood on his knuckles. "Is he dead?" she asked quietly. "He's off the train," the gunman replied, reloading his revolver with methodical precision. He looked out through the wooden slats at the canyon walls blurring past, but Cornwall won't stop, not until the ledger is ash. He closed the cylinder of the gun with a sharp click. "We ride to Fort Worth. From there, we take the fight to him." Fort Worth rose from the prairie, not as a town of canvas and mud, but as a towering monument to cattle, steel, and ruthless ambition. The 4 a.m. freight limped into the Texas and Pacific Railway depot, the iron beast groaning under the weight of its violent journey. The nameless gunman and Clara Higgins slipped from the cattle car before the train fully stopped, melting into the bustling morning crowds of stockyard workers, merchants, and drifting cowboys. Cornwall's influence infected Fort Worth like a creeping sickness. Armed Pinkerton detectives and hired thugs loitered at every street corner, their eyes scanning the crowds for a dust-covered drifter and a red-haired girl. The telegraph operator in Oakhaven had done his job, sending the wire to Judge Isaac Parker, but Cornwall was a desperate, wealthy man fighting a cornered war. He would burn the city down to find them. "We can't just walk to the federal courthouse," Clara whispered, pulling her dust-caked shawl tight over her head to hide her bright copper hair. "He'll have snipers on the roofs and killers in the alleys waiting for us." "We aren't going to the courthouse," the gunman replied, his cold eyes fixed on a massive, 3-story brick mansion overlooking the Trinity River, Thaddeus Cornwall's personal fortress. "You are going to the federal marshal's office. Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves should be arriving by noon with his posse. I am going to see the devil himself." Clara grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "That's suicide. He has an army in there. Let the law handle him." "The law handles the paperwork," the gunman said, his voice as unyielding as a tombstone. "I handle the debt." He escorted Clara through the labyrinthine alleys of the meatpacking district, avoiding the main thoroughfares, until they safely reached the heavily fortified back entrance of the federal building. She held the ledger tight to her chest, her eyes welling with unshed tears. She didn't say goodbye. She knew ghosts didn't care for farewells, and she knew this man was walking directly into the fires of hell for a farmer he barely knew. The gunman turned his back on the safety of the law and walked toward the river. Cornwall's mansion was ringed by wrought iron fences and guarded by a dozen men armed with repeating rifles. The drifter didn't try to sneak in. He walked straight up the cobblestone drive, his Winchester resting casually in the crook of his arm, the blood-soaked bandage on his bicep a stark testament to the miles he had bled to get here. The guards at the main gate raised their weapons, shouting for him to halt. The gunman didn't break his stride. He fired 2 rapid shots from the hip, shattering the heavy brass padlocks on the iron gates, kicking them open with his heavy boot. The courtyard erupted into absolute chaos, but the drifter moved with a terrifying, supernatural calm. He was a storm of lead and fury, his peacemaker and Winchester speaking a language of brutal, efficient violence. He didn't shoot to kill them all. He shot to dismantle Cornwall's shield. He shattered knees and disabled shoulders, leaving a trail of groaning, disarmed enforcers in his wake. Bullets chipped the stone statues and chewed through the manicured hedges around him, but he walked through the crossfire like a man ordained by fate. He kicked open the mahogany front doors of the mansion, stepping into a grand foyer dripping with crystal chandeliers and imported silk. Thaddeus Cornwall stood at the top of the sweeping grand staircase. He was a portly man dressed in an immaculate velvet suit, clutching a silver-handled cane. He looked down at the dust-covered, blood-stained specter standing on his imported Persian rugs. "Do you know how much this carpet costs, you filthy animal?" Cornwall spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of arrogant rage and undeniable terror. "More than a farmer's life," the gunman replied, slowly ascending the hardwood stairs, his spurs chiming a deadly knell. Cornwall took a step back, raising a small, pearl-handled Derringer pistol. "I have millions. I can buy this entire state. Name your price. Gold? Land? I'll give you triple whatever the Higgins girl promised you. I can make you a king out here. Josiah Higgins offered me a bowl of stew and a quiet place to rest my horse," the gunman said, his boots clicking rhythmically on the stairs. "You can't afford my price." Cornwall fired the Derringer. The small-caliber bullet grazed the gunman's cheek, drawing a thin line of crimson. The drifter didn't even blink. He reached the top of the stairs, holstered his revolver, and grabbed Cornwall by the throat with his right hand, lifting the heavy industrialist entirely off his feet. "The ledger is with Bass Reeves," the gunman whispered, his face inches from Cornwall's terrified, bulging eyes. "Your empire is dead. Your men are broken. And if you ever look toward the Higgins Valley again, I will return, and I won't just break your empire." He hurled Cornwall backward into a heavy oak bookshelf. The millionaire collapsed in a heap of splintered wood and expensive leather-bound literature, gasping for air, his cane clattering uselessly across the floor. Heavy pounding suddenly echoed from the shattered front doors. "United States Marshals! Open up!" The unmistakable booming voice of Bass Reeves echoed through the grand mansion. The nameless gunman looked down at the ruined titan of industry one last time. Justice had arrived. The debt was paid in full. He turned and walked down the back servants' corridor, slipping quietly out the kitchen door just as the marshals breached the front. By the time Clara Higgins led Bass Reeves into the ruined foyer to arrest the railroad baron, the only thing remaining of the man who saved her was the lingering smell of cordite and a single bloody boot print on the expensive rug. The ghost had returned to the wind. "Thank you for riding along on this epic journey through the unforgiving heart of the West. If the tale of our nameless drifter, Clara's unyielding courage, and the fall of Cornwall's corrupt empire kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow Western and history buffs. Let's keep the spirit of the frontier alive. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling, immersive stories. We want to hear from you. What did you think of the gunman's final choice? Should he have ended Cornwall right there? Or was handing him over to Bass Reeves the true justice? Drop your thoughts and predictions for our next frontier adventure in the comments below. Until next time, keep your powder dry and keep riding.